complex, much too complex, too complex, much too complex, too complex, too complex, too complex.
Good afternoon. My name is James K. Holder II. Some of you may know me as Sir James II. I'd like to welcome you back to Not On My Watch. As always, I'd like to ask you to like, comment, subscribe, and share. I want you to retweet this and repeat this. If you are watching, today is Friday, February 23rd, 2018, and this is our last special segment for Black History Month on this series. So I invite you to continue to celebrate the month for the next few days and really learn as much as you possibly can. As you know, what the focus has been here is just celebrating and understanding movements of the past and how that can help us navigate the systems that are in place now in our country. So today, I really want to focus on probably the most important movement, the most influential of at least my lifetime, and that would be the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement is one that was long in the making. It didn't start with this hashtag. It had been going on, and it continues to go on. It lives really in all of us, whether we want to know it or not. And so I will say, though, I wish that the movement had more of a front and vocal presence on the current gun issue. So I want to take this episode to discuss one particular instance that kind of relates to how I view the discussion about guns right now. And I want to take you back to July 6th, 2016. Now, on this day, a young mother named Diamond Reynolds began a live feed on Facebook. And on this live feed that was recorded in the Falcon Heights suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, you saw an officer accosting a driver, within 40 seconds, wounding that driver fatally in front of his 4-year-old child and the mother of that 4-year-old child. Now, the officer in question was named Geronimo Yanez, and he had pulled over Philando Castile, who was a pillar of the community, who was, he worked at the local elementary school in the cafeteria. The kids loved him. They pulled him over because of a broken taillight, but also because he fit the description. The two passengers fit the description of someone that they were looking for. This is the comment that came over the radio before this the traffic stop. The two occupants just looked like the people that were involved in a robbery. The driver looks more like one of our suspects because of the wide-set nose. I didn't get a look at the passenger. So again, somehow this person didn't see the passenger, who was Diamond Reynolds, saw the driver with a wide-set nose, and immediately assumed that he was the man who was the suspect in another crime. Pulls him over. Now, it does go without saying, or maybe it doesn't go without saying, Philando Castile up until this point had been pulled over 52 times, and several of those times had resulted in arrests. So we have a system where this young man was doing nothing wrong, gets pulled over by the police. Now, in this altercation, again, we have to continually hark on the fact that within 40 seconds of being pulled over, this officer, Geronimo Yanez, who I think was 28 at the time, had lodged 7 bullets into the car. He had shot 7 bullets into this car, 5 of them hitting Philando Castile and 2 of them penetrating his heart. You shot 7 bullets into this car with a 4-year-old girl in the car. Why? Now, during the stop, this routine traffic stop, you had a situation where, of course, as standard practice, the officer asked Philando Castile for his driver's license and registration. And so before reaching for the driver's license and registration, Philando Castile voluntarily told the officer that he was armed. Now, why is this important? Philando Castile was actually a registered gun owner. He had a permit within the state of Minnesota to carry a firearm. He had received this permit over a year prior to being pulled over on this evening. So that was when the letter officiating the permit was issued to him. It was about a year and a month prior to this fatal officer-involved shooting. Now, Philando Castile tells him he has a gun. The officer says, don't pull out the gun. Philando proceeds to tell him, I'm not reaching for the gun. I'm pulling for the driver's license and registration, as you asked. And again, this officer, you could say it was deliberate, you could say it was unintentional, but again, from that moment, it becomes a horror show on this video that I'm sure you've all seen. I'm not going to replay it here, but we have all seen this video play out. And thank God for the courage of Diamond Reynolds, who during the altercation is documenting, providing proof in a live stream that can't be scrubbed, can't be erased from the American consciousness, as her 4-year-old daughter is consoling her as her father is dying in their sight. This is a traumatic experience that no one should have to live through in this country. And yet, I am frustrated by the level of conversation that ignores these types of interactions with the police. Because when you don't recognize this culture, and again, we know of this instance and that this is how this transpired because of Diamond Reynolds' live feed on Facebook. 2 years prior to this, there was no live stream function on Facebook. I mean, you had Uvu or you had all these other things, but you know, technology has really, really advanced the cause here. And so, Castile dies within an hour of this shooting. He was taken to the hospital eventually. Now, we watched on the tape as he bled out for a very long time before, before the officer called 911, before any action was taken to perhaps try to save his life. But again, 2 bullets in the heart at point blank range. And then really, I'm just kind of like, how do you shoot 7 bullets at point blank range? Your gun is inside of the window of this car. How do you even miss 2 shots? Neither here nor there. Geronimo. This was one of those scenes that really broke the community at large. It galvanized the Black Lives Matter movement even more because this was probably the first case where you looked at an armed suspect who was black and how he was treated by the police, despite having done everything right, despite having disclosed. And again, under Minnesota law, you wouldn't have to coalesce to the fact, or you would not have to tell an officer voluntarily that you had a weapon. It isn't until an officer asks you whether, if you present your driver's license and you present your letter of your permit, and then if the officer asks you, you should disclose, you have to disclose whether you are carrying at the time or not. But I also want to point out the fact that, every state is different. But even in the state of Georgia, if you are allowed to carry a gun in your car as an extension of your home, whether you have a permit or not. It's not required that you have a carry permit to have a gun in your car, whether it's in the glove compartment or the armrest or whatever. So I'm looking at it like I have yet to understand why this man having a gun, regardless of whether he had a permit or not, would have led to his untimely death in front of the mother of his child and his 4-year-old child. So, of course, as par for the course with these situations, the officer is acquitted on all charges. I believe there were a few manslaughter charges. There was no murder charge anyway. And then he was acquitted of those within less than a year. So what does it take for America to understand that these situations aren't changing? They're not improving. And ultimately, the police do not police black citizens in the same way that they do everyone else. whether we are operating within the confines of the law or whether we aren't, there is an added leeway and an impunity with which police enforce laws that aren't really laws on black citizens that really has to be a central part of this conversation on guns. And I have not seen that from anyone. And I've been incredibly disappointed by this, just at every level. It's almost like it's almost like the Black Lives Matter movement didn't exist before. Because where Black Lives Matter mainly focused on bringing out or highlighting the injustice of unarmed black men being killed by the police, there were several instances when, like Philando Castile, who was armed within his rights and yet met his demise because of that. So I want to talk about this because there's been a meme floating around, and I'm going to pull it up on my phone. I'll put it on the screen. And it talks about, well, let me pull this up. Because this has been a very huge point of contention for me, and I really just don't believe in this. It says, if guns were as regulated as cars. Again, if guns were as regulated as cars, black people would still be terrorized within their own communities, whether they were operating within the law or not. And so for those pushing this argument that gun owners, and again, I talked about this last week a little bit, so I'm not going to go over the same points, but I just do want to point this out. Many black people are terrified to drive their cars in this country. They're terrorized and fearful of operating a vehicle within the confines of the law. I have several friends who have just given up their cars altogether because they don't want to be confronted with these interactions, whether it's with the police or other motorists. Because it's not just the police that behave a certain way. You know, when I moved to New York and had a studio in New York, I used to do these long road trips because I had to take all of my equipment with me every time I went somewhere. So I would drive from Atlanta to New York, and most of the time I had to leave at midnight in Atlanta to beat 2 of the traffic cycles to get to New York within a reasonable amount of time. And I mean, I've got to tell you, some of the most fearful times of my life was driving through Virginia by myself at 5 in the morning or 4 in the morning, or driving through South Carolina and having to stop for gas somewhere and hoping that I didn't get, chased off the street at some point. So we have a history in this country where black motorists have never really been fully protected or safe. So I want to talk about just the need to have a gun in your home and why that should be, assumed to be everyone's right, correct? Or if you're going to say that is a right that anyone should have, it should be everyone's right. So on this meme, it talks about a title and tag for each point of sale. Philando Castile had his registration. He had his driver's license. And he was still gunned down by this officer in plain sight at point blank range. So he also had a gun that he told the officer about, and then he also had his documentation. Now it says a driver's training and gun training. So you have to have a driver's training. Now in most states you have a permit phase where you're allowed to get a learner's permit based on having passed a written exam, and then you would then have a period where you're able to learn under the tutelage of a parent or a friend or someone who's teaching you how to drive before you pass a road exam, and then you would advance to be permitted an actual driver's license within your state. Now, this is important. The screen keeps going off. This is important because you really have a situation where we're trying to draw a comparison between things that aren't comparable, right? Because if I'm going to have a title and a tag for each point of sale, there's a lot of different reasons why you have title and tag on a car. And a lot of it has to do with emissions. Serena, you have to pass an emissions test every year in order to pay the tax on your car, which is an every year thing. Now, I'm all for, at the point of sale, having some other tax that you put onto this item, right? So that it's now, You might have a tax that goes towards your state, towards a fund about accidental gunfire. You might have a tax that goes towards some other things, certainly like how they do cigarettes. If you buy a carton of cigarettes, you're paying a lot of money for that carton of cigarettes. Probably more than it's worth, but it's a deterrent from you purchasing it. That makes sense to me. I certainly don't think that it's a prohibitive nature to charge a tax on any item. And certainly it could be a higher tax, but there's certain other, objectives that people are talking about that become problematic at some point. And I think we have to have a reasonable conversation about where these things lie. Do I think you could require a mandatory gun training to own a gun in this country? You could try. I think that practically anytime you force a test on someone, there's an additional fee to that test. There is not going to be shooting ranges that allow you to just go and test a practical application or a skill. I mean, and then theoretically you could have, a virtual test to see if someone can, aim at targets at a certain point, and if they can't, then they can't pass that test. It would be fair and similar to how an eye exam works when you go get your driver's license. But my argument would be if you had a driver's license, most of these states, you're required to have a driver's license before you can apply to have a gun license anyway. So if your vision is proficient and your vision, a car can certainly be a deadly weapon. So if your aim and precision and mobility is proficient for you to operate a vehicle, certainly it would qualify you to operate a gun. That would be my argument. So if someone had a driver's license, it would kind of supersede all of those other regulations. I think when you get to the point where you're requiring someone to take 2 practical exams for any licensure, or 2 like physical exams where you have to go get 2 eye exams. Like I have to get an eye exam every 5 years when I go get my license renewed, and I have to get an eye exam every year when I get a gun. I think that's too much, because it puts an unfair burden of time and also fees on people who are just trying to own this gun that they might have purchased or maybe never even purchased. Maybe they received it as a gift at some point. Maybe it's just in their household. We don't really know the circumstances under all these things. A written test. Again, you'd have to administer a written test. I don't think a written test is necessarily bad for the application process of owning a gun. I think certainly there should be some discussion or some regulation on these are the laws within your state. And I will say, as someone who applied for a gun license and was approved for one through a series of background checks and fingerprinting in the state of Georgia, there was no real, they give you material, you have to go through so many checks and so many different offices and points of contact that you do learn about the process when you're getting this certification or getting this license, but there is no sit down with someone who explains to you, okay, these are your rights once you have this license. And there's, of course, there's websites that explain it, but there is no practical requirement where once you receive this, you know that this is how you operate within the law with this particular permit or permission. And I think that would be added value, because if I'm already, I think I paid maybe $75 or $80 in Georgia to get all that stuff done. Don't quote me on that, because I think it actually was going up around the time that I went to go do it. But either way, you do all this stuff and there's fees associated, but I think you have to lump all that stuff into one series as a service, because I don't have a problem with you charging once every 7 years to apply for a driver's license. I mean, a driver's license or a passport or a gun license. But certainly the gun license should not be an annual thing. It should not be this thing where you have this cumbersome process that you have to go and wait in line and send these records off and apply for all these things. That doesn't really work in any practical way. So if we're gonna do it like you do a driver's license, where you can pay and get a 5-year license, or you can get an 8-year license, or you can do a passport Certainly a passport is valid for 10 years. You have a passport card that's less expensive to get. It doesn't have all the same access, but it's an opportunity for you to, if you only need to go to the Caribbean, you don't need a whole passport process. You can just get a passport card, or however all that works. So those are, I mean, I think there's ways to approach that. Now, this thing starts getting into health requirements. This is where I think it's challenging because, again, owning a gun is not really like owning a car because most people don't own 4 or 5 cars. You might have 4 or 5 cars in your household, but at some point, you only have so much space on your property to maintain a car or keep a car. So, but guns are much, much smaller. So it's much more practical that if you have a household of 2 adults, you would have 2 guns at least, or you'd have multiple types of guns. You might have a shotgun, you might have a pistol, or a revolver, or something within that smaller handgun, purse gun category. So I think when it gets to a point where you're charging or doing a health requirement and doing all these different licensures for each firearm, I think that becomes cumbersome. And then what is the health requirement? That's a really broad statement because there is no real health requirement to have a driver's license. I mean, certainly, if you have certain conditions like epilepsy, an epileptic person cannot drive a car. And that is something that is mandated by your doctor. Now, once you get to that point, then we have a conversation. Because if you're epileptic, and certainly you know you cannot drive a car or operate a car, then does that mean you can't operate a weapon or shouldn't be able to have a gun that, you know, if you're driving a car for a 30-minute span or a 40-minute span to get in one direction and you have to drive that same distance back, that's a lot more exposure to having an episode with any disease that you might have or condition. Not so much so with a gun. You're only in possession of a gun for maybe 10 seconds in an emergency where you're operating it. So I don't know that that overlaps in the same way. There would need to be some discussion because I don't believe that an epileptic person needs to have their guns confiscated once they fit into that particular category. Certainly, if you are suicidal, you know, how do I feel about people who are suicidal having guns in their home? I don't feel good about it. So if someone said, as a council, we're deciding that once you're put in a category of suicide watch, once you're this, once you're that, we're going to come confiscate your guns. Or maybe it's not even a confiscation. Maybe, like you put a boot on somebody's car if they park illegally. Maybe now we put a state-issued gun lock on your gun. You keep the gun, but the gun can't function in your home. Maybe that's the solution. I think that's a much better solution than confiscating. But that's me. Because now you don't have this issue of value coming out where it's, you know, you're taking something from me that has a value. And it could very well be a sentimental value. It might not even be a physical value of a gun. But these guns, some of these guns are like thousands of dollars. So when you start talking about the police are going to come in and take your guns if you don't meet the requirements or you're not operating within the law, which is really all arbitrary anyway, and then the way that these laws are enforced are even more arbitrary, I think you have a challenge there. Talks about liability insurance on each vehicle. This is where I have the problem because liability insurance is a fee. I don't have to have liability insurance on a car to own the car, to keep it parked in my garage, or to operate the car on my own property. I do have to have a liability insurance to operate that car on the street. Now that's very different than owning a gun in your home for your own self-protection. So this is where the conversation really goes astray for me because a lot of progressives are pushing this liability insurance on each gun issue. And I think potentially if gun sellers were held liable for illegal sales or manufacture of certain types of guns, then you have a conversation where charge a tax when someone goes to buy this gun. It's relative to the amount of the fee for that gun itself, possibly. Because now I'm making a decision based on what I can afford. Certainly when you go buy a car, you have in your mind what that car is going to cost in terms of a car note. You have in mind what that car is going to cost to insure and how long you're going to have to insure that car at a certain rate because it's because you still have a car note. So you have to have a higher level of insurance for that car. I think to impose a type of insurance on someone who's already made a purchase on a gun or already inherited said gun, and now they have to assume responsibility for a monthly fee, I think that's completely unfair, it's unreasonable, certainly it's probably unconstitutional. And it's one way of making sure that a law is going to be disproportionately enforced on people of color and poor people in our country. People who are often relegated to living in more dangerous neighborhoods where they need protection in their homes to care for themselves or to prevent certain tragedy. So that's just the reality of where we are. I think it's hard to make the argument that guns are like cars and should be policed as cars are. I'm completely against the liability insurance on each gun argument. Again, if you tie it into a tax that's at the beginning, and then that's a one-time deal, and you say, okay, this type of gun is more likely to misfire, this type of gun is this, so the manufacturer is going to charge a tax, and they're going to keep that in a fund, so that when this gun is present in this type of misfire or this, then there's a fund here that this manufacturer or sales group, conglomerate, can draw from to compensate the victim or the claimant. I would support that. One-time fee, not monthly fees. And then renewals and inspections at intervals. Again, when you start talking about renewals, when you start talking about inspections, you're talking about search and seizure basically. Because now you're saying people have talked about requiring guns to be stored in a certain way in your home and having ammo stored separately from your guns. And I actually don't think that there's a stupider way to do that because it's kind of like, at the moment I need access to a gun in my home, it's because of an emergency situation. So if someone breaks into my home, I really don't have time to find my safe, type in the safe combination, get the gun out, then go to the other safe where my ammo is safely stored, and then load the gun, and then be ready to now defend myself when this group of people comes into my home armed, locked and loaded and ready to go. I think when you start putting those types of forceful stipulations on storage of guns, when you start putting stipulation on inspections and renewals of certain things, I think you're really talking about fees. You're talking about providing some enforcement agency access to a home to search your home and inspect this stuff. And then if you aren't in compliance for whatever reason, if your monthly insurance lapsed because I don't know, maybe your check bounced or maybe there was a clerical error, now you've become criminalized and you're confronted with an officer of the law in your home where they know a gun is present already. So that officer is going to be on edge. We've seen here many cases through the Black Lives Matter movement and the proliferation of live streams and dash cams that, frankly, even when a gun isn't present, officers are all too willing to assume that their lives are in danger and then act with deadly force. So I think that's something we have to be mindful of because these types of laws that people are suggesting are ultimately going to increase the number of interactions with the police. In a situation where someone's home is being searched, someone's home is being investigated, and I really just fundamentally believe that now you're giving away more and more rights. And based on the fact that the police tend to already not enforce laws on cars fairly and equally in this country, I know that it's going to be worse for guns. It's going to be deadly when it comes to guns. So that's not something I'm willing to invite into my home. That's not something I'm willing to invite to the conversation. And I really, really hope that progressives, because actually The GOP doesn't want to ban anything. I'm all about ban assault rifles. Let's bring the assault rifles ban back, or assault weapons. And forgive me if I'm misusing or interchangeably using the phrase assault rifles or weapons and all this other stuff. I don't have time for that conversation here. So if you want to write down in the comments and complain about the specific syntax and language that I'm using, this is not the place for that. An AR-15 is not a gun that anybody needs to have. Do I think someone going in with a revolver that has five shots in it is going to kill everyone in a movie theater with a revolver? No, that's not going to happen. You don't have enough ammo to do that in this gun. You don't. And, you know, same thing with just a little pistol. Like, you got 5 + 1. Maybe you got 7 + 1 in a pistol before you got to put another mag in. So, no, I don't think those people are doing mass shootings and killings. I think the weapons that we see contributing to these mass shootings are ones that have become more accessible since the 2005 repeal of the assault rifles ban that Bill Clinton signed into law and George W. Bush let expire in 2005. And since then, you've seen a dramatic increase in these mass killings in movie theaters, in schools, in abortion clinics. And that's where we really have to start the conversation. Now, my thing is, start that, see where we go. Let's take the ban that the GOP has enforced, the NRA-funded GOP has enforced on making it illegal for the CDC to document these cases. Because if we had an agency collecting the data, now we're not talking out in the wind. We're not just talking out our assholes about, well, this is what the real problem is, that's what the real problem is. Now we know 70% of the issues are caused by this. Now we know 80% of the misfires, which are maybe 12% of all the injuries caused by guns in the country, are 80% of those are caused by someone who's too old to operate a gun or doesn't have the proper eyesight. Then we can say, okay, you know what? If you're going to own a gun and you're over the age of 65, we need to monitor this more if you're over the age of 65, because that's where the correlation happens, at that age. Then it makes sense. But certainly there has to be data behind it. It can't just be these emotional pleas. And I understand, and I'm very proud of the students in Florida. I think it's great what they're doing. I think it's great that the nation is giving them attention. But we really cannot ignore the pleas of the Black Lives Matter movement for the pleas of the students in Florida, because the two really aren't related. There's been many instances where people who attended schools have faced gun violence and been subjected to it that didn't get any attention because they didn't go to a certain type of school. So when we have a country that already has segregated schools, segregated communities, the types of experiences that white people have when it comes to cars, car insurances, guns, gun insurances, and the way all of those things are enforced by the police, we really do have to take into consideration the differences. And we have to listen to both sides. So that's my only point here. I would say that it all starts with an assault weapons ban or assault rifle ban. No one should be walking around with an AR-15 rifle. There's no need for that or anything similar to that. I think that you might have a better job at policing the ammunition as opposed to policing the sale of guns themselves, because guns are very transactional. It's a community-based thing. You say I'm crazy, you say I'm siding with the NRA, and I'm really not. I'm telling you that there are communities and pockets in this country where they have nothing else going on in their entire local economy other than a gun show. And people rely on the gun show. I mean, I'm serious with you. There's places in this country where that's all they have. And they're not necessarily going out shooting people with these guns. Maybe they don't need them. Maybe they're stockpiling them for fun. They have collections. I collect classic cameras. I collect fire extinguishers. I collect plastic safari animals. I collect cast iron pots. I collect Paul Revere trophy bowls. I don't collect guns, but some people do. And so when you start criminalizing things that people own and feel close to and connected to, whether it's because of their heritage, whether it's because of their geography, whether it's because of their neighborhood or their upbringing, you really have to be considerate of it. I'm not saying again, that everybody should be able to have as many guns as they want. That's not the argument here. But you have to be aware of the way that people use their guns and feel that they need them. You know, some of y'all talk about urban areas and urban crime and urban guns. The gun laws in New York are very different than the gun laws in Georgia, and that's fine for New York, because a grizzly bear, and pardon me, because I don't want to go down this Betsy DeVos path, but if you live in New York, a grizzly bear is not going to run into your backyard and maul your children while they're playing. That's just not going to happen in New York. It could happen in Alaska, though. It could very well happen in Idaho or, you know, one of the flyover states. Pardon my French. But you can't now employ a whole federal policy that says no shotguns. No matter where you are in the 50 states in the U.S., no shotguns. That doesn't really make a lot of sense, because the conditions and the situations that people fear and therefore feel safer because having a gun are not universal, actually. So I just want to put that out there. When you're thinking about all these federal policies and proposals, you really can't do it from the mindset of, this is just my individual situation in my community. You can advocate for your community and what it is in your situation that is relevant at the time, but you really have to be aware and open to having a conversation with people who just are faced with a different set of geographical circumstances. And I'm asking all Americans to understand that as a Black American who is targeted by the police in operating a motor vehicle, and always has been, I'm not particularly interested in coalescing to an analogy or metaphor that says guns should be policed just like cars are, because that means I'm going to be over-policed in my home, in my community, in my neighborhood. I'm going to be faced with more deadly interactions potentially in my home, in my neighborhood. And actions of simply owning something that was inherited or purchased years ago are now going to be criminalized and make me a target at the hands of a police force that automatically, I feel, works in a lopsided, racist way in this country. So that is my position on the argument with guns. I hope you just look at the facts. I mean, look at all the things that Philando Castile did right. According to many people siding with this analogy of the guns, Philando Castile would have been in his right in every aspect of this, and yet he still met his untimely demise in front of his family. So how does that make, if you make the argument that policing guns like cars makes us safer, who is us? Because it didn't make Philando Castile safer. So where does that leave us? Where are we in the conversation? And I'm going to be continually vocal on this. I've had many people who say that I am a paid NRA shill now because I'm saying that there shouldn't be monthly fees associated. Don't criminalize poverty is what I'm saying. Don't criminalize someone who can't afford a monthly fee on something they already own. Again, if you have a one-time tax on a point of sale, that's very different. Because now I can, if I say I got $800 set aside to go buy a Glock, and that's what I want, and I want 2 clips on this Glock, and I want to get some ammo. Then I can say, okay, I'm gonna budget this out. Maybe I can get the gun for $6, maybe I can get the extra clip for $1, and maybe there's a $300 tax on this $800 gun, or this $600 gun. A $300 tax on a $600 gun, to me that's not exorbitant, because I'm not buying multiple guns every year. I really shouldn't be, and if I can afford a $600 gun, I could probably afford a one-time fee of a 50% tax on the purchase of that gun. Can I afford a 50% tax on that gun every year? Hell no, and I'm not interested in paying that. And if I can't pay it one year where I thought I could pay it, I shouldn't have to give that gun up that costs $600, and I shouldn't have to be criminalized for it. So the one-time fee that incorporates an insurance, I think that's a discussion we can talk about. But that's what it needs to be. And you have to now side with the idea that gun manufacturers and licensors and sellers are going to be held responsible for these things, not the individual citizen. I don't think that's particularly fair. So let's move along to something else. And I know we're running on time while it's already been 40 minutes. There's been a lot of conversation within. What I do here is a form of black vlogging. There's a huge community of black vloggers, and you know, YouTube did a little bit to try to promote black bloggers and vloggers on YouTube on the channel for the month of February, and I thought that was kind of cute, but they didn't really do a great job. But whatever, neither here nor there. I want to give a shout out to Miss Wendy Williams, because Wendy Williams to me is sort of did a really good job of setting the standard for what this conversation is, or the types of conversations that we're having. You talk a little bit about politics, you talk a little bit about community, talk a little bit about pop culture and celebrity, and you also talk about sort of reality television, things that people are broadly interested in. And there's a lot of bloggers out there who do similar work. Wendy Williams recently announced that she was taking a 3-week vacation from work because of her health. And I think that is very, I applaud Wendy Williams for being transparent about all of her situations. She never really shies away from her past drug use. She doesn't shy away from talking about her Graves' disease, her thyroid condition. And so I really commend her for that, because I don't think we're entitled to know that stuff. But I do wish her a speedy recovery and rapid health and return to the show, because certainly I do watch her show when it's uploaded on her YouTube channel basically every day. I don't watch the show in real time because I don't do television, I don't do commercials. But when she uploads it to the channel, I do watch it. For those who are like me and watch that channel or watch those shows, you might feel a gap now that she's missing in action for a little while. So I just want to talk about a couple of other groups that you could watch. The Breakfast Club. Now, obviously, I don't need to spot the Breakfast Club because they have a huge platform, but they do good work. And they do really good interviews with a broad array of people. And so even if you're not like fully interested in everyone they interview, they do good work, and they're often talking about the things that everybody else is talking about. Now, Monique is still on tour this month. She is still talking about the Netflix ban, and I think she's beating a dead horse at this part. And today she went to beating dead donkeys. The host of the Breakfast Club, Charlamagne the God, aka Leonard, as Monique, Miss Nikki Parker would call him, really just took issue with being labeled Donkey of the Day. And now I would just want to award Monique the Donkey of the Decade award, because she has gone on and put so much energy into this public feud with Netflix and Lee Daniels and Will Packer and Oprah Winfrey and Tyler Perry. And I think it's just sort of disgraceful at this point. I really wish people would stop giving her a platform. And yet they will continue to do so. So, Charlamagne, keep your head up. I don't agree with everything you do. I thought that Monique was very unfair to you in assessing that because you didn't agree with her protest against Netflix, that you must be hateful to all black women. I think that was a terrible argument. The biggest issue I've taken with Monique on this entire boycott is that she continually weaponizes being a woman and black to try to make arguments that people like Will Packer are like Harvey Weinstein. And I was very, very pleased that Angela Yee and all of you really came together and called her out for that, because she's been on this interview tour and no one has called her out for that once. So y'all actually did due diligence on that, so thank you. It was a good interview. It was entertaining as hell, but it really needs to stop. There's been a big issue with the Queen's Court. The Queen's Court is the rapper Kaya, who worked with the online personality T.S. Madison, aka Maddie, and that's an interesting pair. They've done a lot of stuff. They have tons of videos online. I'm not going to get into what they got going on drama-wise, but the meltdown of the Queen's Court is a fascinating thing to watch, because as we're talking about access and opportunities within the space of black bloggers or personalities online, and where our access is and what our opportunities are, if we want to become a Wendy Williams, if we want to become an Oprah Winfrey, if we want to become a Charlamagne the God, then you have to go through the channels that the Queen's Court may have been approaching to try to get to and build that access, build that platform and the brand. And they faced a categorical Class A nuclear meltdown recently, and it has been a big part of the conversation within our particular community of online content providers. So that's something to look into. Many of the following people that I'm going to shout out have been talking about it. So again, you can follow T.S. Madison, you can follow Kaya. They now kind of split and they each have their own thing. In the absence of Wendy Williams' show, this comes on daily. Funky Dineva is probably one of my favorite people online. And Funky Dineva does a really good job of talking about, again, bridging that gap between politics, reality television. If you miss Wendy Williams, you'll probably like Funky Dineva a lot. They're really not similar in their approach. I think Funky Dineva's point of view is maybe a little bit more pro-black than Wendy Williams. Funky Dineva tapes out of Atlanta, so culturally, the perspective from that show is more Southern, which I think is more universal than someone who's black and from the North, which is, again, where you find The Breakfast Club and Wendy Williams. Throwing that out. Actually, well, Charlamagne is Southern, so let me take that back. But I mean, I think when it comes to online personalities and black bloggers, I think you see a huge disparity in terms of like how we approach topics, whether you're from New York or whether you're from the South, or whether you're from the North or the South or the West. I think it's very different. So that's one thing to maybe look for. Funky Dineva. Ashley Miller, 1987, I think is her tagline. Hilarious. She reviews movies and shows, and she's really, 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 really funny. There's Unwind with Tasha K. Really funny. Now, you see, I got my coffee here. Tasha K unwinds with a big-ass glass of wine, and she reviews the wine at the end of the show. But she talks about hot topics, and it's really, really, really funny. And she sounds a lot like MC Lyte. But so it would kind of be like if MC Lyte was drunk on YouTube, tipsy on YouTube, and then was doing a comedy special as opposed to rapping. And she's very pretty too. And she also has been transparent about health challenges that she's had. So one really good one to watch. Soulful Tea she's more of a cooking personality, but she does commentary as well. Soulful Tea is maybe not for everybody, but she cooks really interesting food. Not necessarily my style of cooking, but I do watch her cooking programs. She does some conversations about politics and other things in a separate podcast. So I would say follow Soulful Tea and subscribe to her, because she also is struggling with weight and I believe high blood pressure. And so she goes to visit doctors and they give her feedback on camera, and she's very transparent about that stuff. So if you're someone who maybe is struggling with diabetes, she does a good job of branching her particular challenges with weight loss or sleep apnea and the diet that she's trying to change, because she's had a high sodium diet with a lot of meat and different things. And so on her show, she goes over like vegan recipes and way to kind of reduce certain things in her cooking. So she's a good person to watch. And then Rambling Reviews, she does videos out of her car, and it's like funny. She's really funny. She's really funny because like stuff flies over her car, and then like she's funny and maybe not completely intentional, but she's really funny and good to watch. I would say check out a couple of her videos, see what's up. And there's thousands of us out here who do this stuff every day, putting up new content. So if you're like me and you don't watch TV and you look for like online people to kind of just discuss things and maybe get a point of view or broaden your point of view on it, if you maybe are a white person who's really interested in politics, but you don't have like black friends, that's not a read. I'm just saying a lot of people find ourselves in a situation. These voices are not represented in mainstream media in any significant way. And so it's good to kind of follow along with these types of people who are just putting it out there. They're not policed by, commercialized media. And so they can really say whatever the hell they want to say. And And with that, I'm just going to close off my last Black History Month episode of the month. I hope you have enjoyed my African shirts. This is probably my favorite one, with the black and the brown. I will probably resume normal, like just my regular style of clothing after this. Season 3 of Not on My Watch has been a challenge leading up to for a lot of different reasons. But I thank you all for watching and being patient with me as always. I want to definitely streamline this, make it better. Future episodes will not be as long as these. It's Black History Month, so because we're talking about history and also the current politics, it does necessitate a little bit more time to have those conversations to get off the ground. But definitely subscribe, like, comment, and share, and continue to donate to the show. This is our time for our Friends of the Show segment. So please make sure you make a contribution of $1 or more to get your shout out in the next episode of the show to www.paypal.me/jkh2. Today I'm thanking Geraldine T, Sumi B, Courtney H, Elizabeth C, Suzanne G, and Pleiades M for their contributions to the show. And thank you so much for watching. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next week on the next episode of Not on My Watch. Relax, relate, resist. Thank you.
Too complex, much too complex, too complex, much too complex, too complex, too complex, too complex.